Hey there. So this is Nicole Van Tassel with I Explore Science, and I got a question from a Spark Science member about starting with student-driven learning, particularly considering that you're teaching multiple classes, some of which are the same prep, but also if it's student-driven, are they the same prep? And just staying ahead and all of that. So I wanted to address that question and address it in a way that might be valuable for others as well. So, okay, I am going to start with, there's a lot of parts to this question. First of all, one of the questions that she had was just simply starting class each day or like your bell ringer. That, honestly, your warm-up doesn't necessarily need to be related to your student-driven learning plan. Like I've shared recently, my warm-up strategy is going to be simply incorporating a phenomenon and really developing my students' curiosity. So focusing on those notice and wonder type activities and incorporating other science practices by sometimes the phenomenon might be presented as a data set versus like a video, or maybe giving them a lens of a cross-cutting concept. So there are some things that if you're like, okay, how can I have student-driven learning but also prepare for all of these classes? There are some things that honestly can be the same across the board, whether you are teaching a life science course or an earth science course or like integrated 6th, integrated 7th, like whatever. Make your life simple if you can, right? You're still developing the skills that students need for student-driven learning by doing activities like that, even if it's not content specific to that grade level. So the second question is, how can you be prepared or prep if you don't know what questions your students are going to ask? And that question is answered by making sure your anchor phenomenon and how your students experience it are really targeted toward the end goal. And I actually have an entire different YouTube video that looks at how we can use our anchor experiences to reach our content objectives, aka how can we really target the way we engage our students with a phenomenon so that it is very clear, even though we're letting them ask the questions, it's really clear which questions are going to first come to their mind. Of course, they're going to have unrelated questions, irrelevant questions, random questions, but we don't have to follow all of those. We can validate them, we can accept them, we can recognize them, we can put them on the board. But if our anchor experience, our anchor phenomenon is targeted well, then those questions, our students can even learn to look at them and ask themselves, is answering that question going to help me understand what happened in this phenomenon? And simply by reflecting on that, they might realize no, or they should realize eventually over time, they should realize that no, that question is not actually going to help me understand this phenomenon or accomplish the task presented in my anchor. So it's an interesting question, but I'm not going to follow that. So with that in mind, you engage your students with this phenomenon. It's designed to get them down a certain pathway or to spark certain questions. They ask the questions, but how do you stay ahead of the game, right? How do you recognize where they're going next? So there are a couple of different ways you can do this. You can, if you're really stressed out about it, make your life simple and you can say, we're starting with this question. It's not it's not fully embracing student-driven, but it's still a step in a better direction than, previous ways of teaching where we were just like, hey, you're learning about cells today and I don't care what questions you have about it, I'm going to tell you the information, right? So it's making progress either way. And we can accept that and we can celebrate that and we can recognize that's okay. Honestly, this school year, I'm starting with a new curriculum that I'm not familiar with. It's not mine. The school purchased one. And it is not particularly student-driven the way it's written. I'm exploring how I'm going to incorporate this. My goal is to is to for sure engage my students with an anchor, for sure have them generate questions. I am still figuring out at this point, I'm sorting the lessons right now to see if I can identify pathways that students can work down so that if they ask a question, I can pull that lesson out. But there's also a possibility that once I get into this school year, if I'm having trouble like seeing the big picture of this curriculum because I've never used it before, I might just kind of be like, okay, this question, we're gonna move down this one. And that's okay. I mean, again, it's better than nothing. So give yourself a break, first of all. These are what we're working towards. More student driven is what we're working toward. It doesn't mean you're gonna reach the end game, this end line or whatever this year. So that is one option, just being like, you're letting them generate the questions, but then you're saying we're going down this question. Another, like a one step further, would be guiding students toward a question that you have in mind through discussion. So this would be where your students are asking the questions, you begin to sort them together, and you talk with them about like, okay, we really need to understand what happened here. We really need to understand why koalas are particularly like in need of saving, or in need of like conservation efforts. We need to be able to answer, why they're genetically special. We need to answer why it's an important issue right now. We need to answer like whatever else, because that is the task that was presented or that was given to us in our anchor experience. So knowing that, like these questions we have here, which question might be the first one that we should, work down? And let's say you're like, I want to focus on why it's important right now, aka resource availability, habitat destruction, human impacts, climate change, all of that, versus the genetic component. I want to focus on why koalas are genetically unique. In that discussion, I would probably gear my students toward understanding or toward questions and toward thinking about the environment that koalas live in and why it's important this year that they get this they get this grant. Again, this was part of the anchor experience. It's koalas at risk in the Endangered Genome Spark. But I would just kind of really focus my attention and my discussions with students toward that pathway if that's where I want them to go. And so with that in mind, I can be like, I know I really want them to like single out this question because that's the lesson I want to come next. And I'm going to kind of push them there through our discussion, through our talking. And I would encourage you to, if that's the route you want to go, I would encourage you to just think of like some things you might say to students, which I have not prepared right now, but some things you might want to say to students to help them go down that route. That said, if you want to take it to the next level and you're like, well, I have these two different pathways, I don't care which one we do first. You might simply, during this navigation discussion phase, you might simply see where their questions, where their questions are going, see where they have the most questions, and start there and recognize that, well, if we're starting here, our first question that they need to answer is like, what are the instructions inside our cells? Like, what is DNA? Or how, what is DNA? How do our cells know to make us this way? Whatever it is. Maybe that's not the first one. I'm just randomly trying to think of things. I didn't prepare my examples ahead of time. So I would know that if we're going down this way, this is the first lesson that I think that we should probably answer. And if we're going down this way, like toward the habitat, resource availability, all of that stuff, I might have students, I need them to realize that their habitats or maybe I need them to realize that they only live in these certain regions and why that is because of their diet. Or I need them to realize that the areas where they live are declining, and that could then segue into, well, then why can't they just live in a different spot? And then you get to like their diet and what they eat and what they need to survive, resource availability. So you can see like you can go at it different ways. So even that same example, I could start with what, sorry, my kid's screaming out there. There's a parent, it's fine. I could start with why do koalas live where they live? Resource availability kind of focus. Or I could start with their habitat and then move into the problem with that is like their habitat is being destroyed. Or I could start with like their habitat is being destroyed and they can't live other places because of resource availability and why they live where they live. On the genetic side, maybe you start with like, well, how do we have those instructions? And then, you get into how did they get that different DNA or whatever, like the mutations. How did they get that diversity? So if you're kind of leaving it more open-ended, my suggestion would be to identify a starting point for kind of each of these pathways that aligns to like a lesson or an activity that answers the first question that you think is important for them to answer. In like a wonderful world where you have, the entire curriculum, all of the resources, this could be something where you kind of really leave it open-ended. At the end of class, you decide this is the question we need to answer. And because you're so familiar with the curriculum and the lessons and the activities, you're like, okay, I can pull out this activity, I can pull out this lesson, and we can do this tomorrow. But if that, and I have all the resources ready for that already, but that's probably not the world you're actually teaching in right now, and that's okay. So my recommendation would be to kind of have an idea of where you want them to go, if you want to do more teacher directed, or where they could go, within 1 to 2 pathways or whatever, have the resources ready for those 1 or 2 lessons that would answer the first question within those pathways, and then like go from there. You are not going to we are probably not at a place, your students are probably not at a place where you can come up with a question in the middle of class and then like immediately follow it. Your students don't necessarily have the science skills to do that, even if they wanted to. And you probably like aren't comfortable doing that right now either. And that's okay too. So really you can take it where you are. At the very least, you are engaging them with that anchor experience. You are letting them generate questions. And then from that point, you can decide how teacher-driven or how student-driven you want to be with those questions. The only thing I would say, if you want to work toward being more student-driven and you're like, what can I do? My suggestion would be to take a look at all of the activities that you have available to you, whether it is like resources that I provide through Spark Science, or it's like activities that you've done in the past that you've enjoyed, or activities you know about, or whatever, and match them up to questions. So if your students ask what is DNA, then you have a lesson that's ready to go for that. Like you might have to make the copies and print it out and assign it or whatever, but like what you're going to grab when it's time to ask that question. And what triggers that lesson. It's almost like the question triggers the lesson. If a totally different unit, body invaders, your students read about the smallpox epidemic and they ask like, well, why did some people get sick and other people didn't? Okay, we're going right into this immune system lesson. And then after the immune system lesson, you're like, as soon as we start this immune system lesson, they're going to ask about like what cells are, because it's going to talk about white blood cells and they're not going to know what that is. Or they're going to ask like, well, what are viruses and how are they different from bacteria? And you're like, that's going to trigger my characteristics of living things lessons, and you can pull that out. So if you can match up each of your lessons into a question or maybe a couple questions, you can kind of have this, when my kids ask this question or we decide to go down this route, these are the lessons that I pull out for that content, for that objective, for that idea. So that would be my recommendation of how you can use student-driven approaches and still plan ahead or stay ahead of your students. Please do not feel like you need to have your students generating a question at the beginning of class and then that whole class is like devoted to answering that question, because no, you have no materials available. And as the learning guide, your job is to bring in those materials that help your students figure it out and explore those ideas. So you need to have time to prepare. Maybe someday down the road when our students have more science skills, they can do more of that themselves, finding the data, analyzing it, developing their investigations in the moment and all of that. But like the odds are, this is new for you, this is new for your students, they still need your guidance at this point. So don't be afraid or don't think that you can't provide that. We just also want to make sure that we are giving them a chance to have a more active voice and more active choice in where their learning goes. But obviously, if you're listening to this, you probably are on board with that already. I hope this was helpful, and I'm going to continue answering a couple other questions that came up.